October 1415. A cold dawn breaks over northern France and an army is dying. Not on a battlefield, not in a charge. Simply dying, slowly, miserably, one man at a time. Dysentery has torn through the English ranks for weeks. Men who marched into France with fire in their eyes now stumble forward hollow-cheeked, trembling, barely able to lift a sword. The great English force that sailed from Southampton with ambition and confidence has been ground down to something barely recognizable. What began as an army of perhaps 15,000 has been ravaged by siege, by sickness, and by the brutal arithmetic of a campaign gone wrong. What remains is approximately 6,000 men. 6,000 exhausted, hungry, disease-weakened soldiers, stranded deep inside enemy territory, trying to reach the safety of Calais before the entire French nation falls upon them. And now, blocking their path across the fields near a small village called Agincourt, stands the assembled might of France. 30,000 men. Still argue about the exact number, but every source agrees on one thing: the French won by a ratio that should make the outcome a foregone conclusion. Knights in gleaming plate armor. Noblemen competing for the honor of capturing the English king. Fresh troops, well-fed, well-rested, certain of victory. The flower of French chivalry gathered in one place, ready to end this embarrassing English intrusion once and for all. By every rational calculation, England should lose this battle. Badly. And yet, within hours, thousands of French soldiers would lie dead on the muddy fields of Agincourt, and one of the most impossible victories in military history would be born. The question is not simply who won. The question is how. How does an army that should not even be alive somehow defeat one of the most powerful forces in medieval Europe? The answer is not simple, and it is far more extraordinary than luck. To understand what happened on that October morning, you have to understand how Henry V's army came to be standing there at all, exhausted, cornered, and somehow still fighting. The 100 Years' War between England and France had been grinding on, intermittently, since 1337. It was less a single conflict than a long, ugly argument over who had the right to rule France, punctuated by famous battles, uneasy truces, and decades of smoldering resentment. By 14 V had inherited a kingdom with a strong claim to the French throne, or so his lawyers argued, and the young king decided to press that claim with an army and a will of iron. He landed in Normandy in August and laid siege to the fortified port of Harfleur. The siege succeeded, but at a terrible price. The town held out for 5 weeks. The summer heat, the proximity of the marshes, the cramped conditions of a medieval siege, all of it combined to unleash dysentery through the English camp with devastating efficiency. Thousands of men were lost. Thousands more were sent back to England too sick to continue. Henry pressed on anyway, driven by something that looked either like extraordinary courage or a reckless refusal to admit the campaign was already failing. His decision to march overland to Calais, around 260 miles away, with what remained of his army, was either a bold strategic statement or an act of desperation dressed up in confidence. Probably both. The march lasted over 2 weeks. Food ran short. Rain fell constantly. The men were weakening with every step. And all the while, the French army was shadowing them, gathering strength, cutting off crossing points on the River Somme and forcing the English on longer, more exhausting detours. By the time Henry's army finally found a crossing and turned toward Calais, they were a shadow of what they had been. And the French were waiting for them. The French commanders had every reason for confidence. Their army was enormous. Their soldiers were fresh. Their knights were among the most heavily armored warriors in the world, trained from birth in the arts of war, and burning with the kind of aristocratic pride that made retreat feel like personal humiliation. France had humiliated England before and would do so again. This English adventure was an irritant, not a threat. When the two armies finally came face to face near Agincourt on the evening of October 24th, the French nobility reportedly quarreled over who would have the honor of capturing Henry himself. They were already planning the victory celebration. They had 30,000 men, some estimates say more. They had armored cavalry, they had crossbowmen, they had the wealth of one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe behind them. What they did not have, what almost no one in the world had at that point, was a weapon quite like the English longbow. The longbow is easy to underestimate when you read about it in a history book. A stick, a string, an arrow. How decisive could it really be? The answer lies not in the technology itself, but in what it demanded of the men who used it. An English longbowman was not simply a soldier handed a bow. He was the product of years, sometimes a lifetime, of training that began in childhood. The draw weight of a war longbow was somewhere between 100 and 150 pounds. Modern compound bows, with all their mechanical advantages, rarely exceed 70%. Drawing a longbow of that weight, accurately, repeatedly, under battlefield stress. It required a physique that archaeologists can literally identify in skeletal remains. The bones of English archers are asymmetric. The left arm is visibly overdeveloped from years of drawing. These were not conscripts with weapons. They were specialists, as trained and conditioned as any professional athlete. And in battle, they could unleash perhaps 10 to 12 arrows per minute, accurately, at ranges up to 250 yards. An English force of 5,000 archers could theoretically put 60,000 arrows into the air in a single minute. Against unprotected men and horses, that was not just dangerous, it was catastrophic. But here is where the story gets more complicated, because longbows were not a secret. The French knew about them. They had faced them at Crécy in 1346, and at Poitiers in 1356, two earlier battles where English archers had played decisive roles. If the longbow was simply an unstoppable weapon, why hadn't every army in Europe adopted it? The answer is revealing. You cannot simply hand soldiers longbows and expect results. You need generations of trained specialists, a culture built around the weapon, national infrastructure supporting its development. France had none of that. And so France had to find another answer, and they believed they had one. Armored knights in thick enough plate could withstand arrows, charge fast enough, close the distance before the archers could do their work, and the bows became irrelevant. The plan was logical. What made it fatal was the ground. In the days before the battle, autumn rains had been falling across northern France. The fields near Agincourt, freshly plowed agricultural land, had turned into something closer to a bog. When Henry surveyed the ground, he recognized something crucial. The battlefield was flanked on both sides by dense woodland, which meant the French could not use their numerical advantage to simply overwhelm the English flanks. The front the French had to attack across was narrow, perhaps 900 yards wide, perhaps less, and that ground was saturated with mud. Henry positioned his archers on the wings, angled inward so they could pour arrows into the center of any advancing force. He ordered sharpened stakes driven into the ground in front of the archer positions, a defense against cavalry. And then he waited. The French, for reasons that still puzzle historians, also waited. They were confident. They had the numbers. They controlled the strategic situation. Why rush? And so for hours on the morning of October 25th, the two armies faced each other across a few hundred yards of rain-soaked earth, neither side willing to be the first to move. Henry understood something the French did not fully appreciate. Time was not England's friend. His men were starving and sick. The longer they stood in the cold, the weaker they became. He needed a battle, and he needed it now, and so he made a decision that was either brilliant or insane. He ordered his army to advance toward the French position. His entire force, archers and men-at-arms, moved forward across the muddy field, stopping within longbow range of the French lines. The archers drove their stakes again into the new ground, and then they opened fire. What happened next is one of the most debated and reconstructed moments in military history, but the broad outline is clear. The French cavalry, spurred into motion by the arrow storm, charged, and the mud swallowed them. Horses are heavy animals. Armored war horses, carrying armored knights, are extraordinarily heavy. They sank into the waterlogged soil with every step. Their momentum, the momentum on which the entire French plan depended, dissolved into a grinding, lurching struggle against the earth itself. The arrows kept coming, 10 to 12 per archer per minute. Thousands of shafts in the air at once, finding the gaps in armor, finding the horses, driving animals into panicked, rearing chaos. Horses wheeled and bolted. Some turned back into the advancing French infantry. The carefully ordered lines of the most powerful army in France began to dissolve before the battle had properly begun. And then the French infantry advanced. They had to. They had no choice now. The battlefield demanded it. But the advance, which should have been a rolling wave of steel, became something else entirely. The woodland on the flanks channeled every soldier toward the center. The mud slowed every step. And the men at the back, thousands of them, pressing forward, eager for glory, pushed into the men in front, who pushed into the men in front of them, until the vanguard of the French army was not an advancing fighting force but a packed, barely mobile mass of humanity. Plate armor in the 15th century was a magnificent feat of engineering. It was also extraordinarily heavy, and in deep mud, with men pressing in from behind, it became a trap. Knights who stumbled could not get up. Men who fell were crushed by the weight of those behind them. There are accounts, probably exaggerated but built on real horror, of men suffocating in the press, unable to breathe, unable to move, surrounded by their own allies. The French army's greatest strength, its sheer mass of men, had become its greatest weakness. There was simply no room to fight. Henry's men-at-arms met the disorganized French vanguard with discipline and controlled violence. The English were outnumbered, but they were not fighting 30,000 men simultaneously. They were fighting the few hundred who could actually reach them through the mud and the crush, and they were fighting them with the energy of men who had already been given up for dead and had nothing left to lose. The archers, when they ran low on arrows, drew swords and hatchets and waded into the flanks. The battle was ugly and brutal and short. By the time the carnage settled, estimates suggest that between 6,000 and 10,000 French soldiers had died. Some of the greatest names in French nobility lay dead in the mud. Dukes, counts, constables of France, men whose lineages stretched back centuries. English casualties, by contrast, were counted in the hundreds. The numbers are still almost impossible to believe. So why did England win? Not because of luck, not because of one weapon, not because of divine intervention, though Henry certainly framed it that way afterward. England won because of the convergence of factors that individually might have been survivable, but together were fatal to France. Henry chose his ground with a commander's eye, funneling the French into a killing zone. His archers disrupted the cavalry charge at its most vulnerable moment, when speed was everything and speed was impossible. The rain had turned the battlefield into an equalizer that stripped France of its most decisive advantage, the ability to deploy its numbers. The narrow front made the French mass a liability rather than an asset. And at the critical moment, French discipline collapsed under the weight of their own ambition, knights competing for glory, instead of fighting as a coordinated force, the chain of command breaking down in the chaos in the mud. Henry, meanwhile, held his men together with the force of his own will, and the simple clarity of a man who had accepted that he might die that day, and had decided to make his death cost France everything he could. His decision to advance, to move toward the enemy rather than wait to be overwhelmed, was the kind of aggressive clarity that seizes the moment before it can close. What happened at Agincourt was not a miracle. It was a masterclass in turning disadvantage into advantage, in understanding not just your own army but the army you were facing and the ground between you. Henry did not win in spite of being outnumbered. In some ways he won because of it, because it forced him to think harder, choose better, and fight with an intensity that the overconfident French never matched. England should not have won at Agincourt. France should not have lost. The French army that stood on that field was, by almost every measurable standard, the superior force. And that is precisely what makes Agincourt endure, not as a comfortable story about underdogs and luck, but as a cold, unsettling reminder that in war, numbers do not fight. People do. Terrain does. Weather does. Decisions do. And on one rain-soaked October morning in northern France, every one of those invisible forces aligned against the side that should have been invincible, and the side that should have been dead walked off the field victorious. Some victories are won by the greatest ones or won by the better mind.